Okay, introduction to driveline. Gonna talk about the different driveline types. We've got quite a few vehicles up here. We got some more in here on the lift, ready to go. Let's start with what I find to be the most basic. It's gonna be on this two-wheel drive Tacoma. Used to be a Terminix truck, or was at least going to be. So, in this particular driveline type, it's a front engine. It's longitudinally mounted, so that's kind of like front to rear, meaning the belts would be at the front, so right up here we got the belts, and then that goes into a actual transmission. So on this transmission, lighting's kind of hit and miss here. Let me do my dim light. This is just a regular straight rear wheel drive transmission specifically. It does go to a rear drive shaft. This rear drive shaft has a slip yoke that goes into the transmission extension housing, and it will slip right there. It'll get longer and shorter to make up for the suspension travel. And then two-piece drive shaft. This is a center support bearing, often called a carrier bearing. So the front drive shaft's got a front universal joint, goes into the carrier bearing. Rear drive shaft's got a front universal joint and a rear, so this has a total of 3 universal joints, and that's all going to go into this rear axle assembly. A lot of times they'll call this the housing. You'll notice there's no bolts on the back side of this because that whole assembly goes in the front side, so this is a lot of times called the carrier. So the drive shaft basically comes in, bolts up companion flange to companion flange there, turns the pinion turns the ring gear. We'll get more into how the differential works, but this is your basic two-wheel drive. Note, there's a drive shaft for the rear, and it comes out of the back of the transmission directly. No front anything. So there's your first basic. The next one, this is about the same as the next one we're going to use the FJ Cruiser. It'd be the same as a four-wheel drive Tacoma. We'll get right there. And here we go. So, the FJ Cruiser is what's known as a part-time four-wheel drive. So, again, it's a longitudinally mounted engine. These are belts in the front, right? Engine comes this way, bolts up to our transmission, similar to the other one. Don't mind this thing. We'll come back to that. So, bolts are up. They're both automatic, so within there's a torque converter. Comes off the back, and here's where it's different. You'll notice it doesn't taper down to that extension housing. It's got the big, bulky transfer case hanging off of it. Let's come back to the transfer case. Then a drive shaft comes out the back. Single drive shaft, companion flange to companion flange, rear U-joint, front U-joint, companion flange to companion flange. So here's my first point. If this vehicle goes over a bump, we need to make this drive shaft get longer and shorter. We don't have it slide in and out of the transfer case. There's not enough room in there. If we had an extension housing on a two-wheel drive, we'd have it slide there like a slip yoke, but this doesn't have that type. This has actually a slip yoke built into the drive shaft. So the drive shaft itself gets longer and shorter, and it bolts flange to flange. So a lot of times these will have a grease fitting. Here it is right there on this one. That's something that's supposed to be lubricated periodically, but a lot of people don't even realize it's there. If that is not greased and this drive shaft kind of seizes up or starts to stick, it'll actually feel like when you come to a stop, a big clunk, or when you accelerate, a big clunk, because on a stop you'd be nose diving, and on an accelerate, the back end kind of squats down, and that requires this to change length. So it's not real technical. Same thing, rear axle, it's got the carrier, bolts up. This is all pretty much the same. Now, just in that Tacoma and this, we really should have pretty much the same tire size left to right, because if we don't, we're going to have this differential working like crazy. But on the Tacoma, it doesn't care front to rear. So you could have big tires on the back, small tires on the front. There's no mechanical connection in the driveline between the two. However, this is a four-wheel drive, so this transfer case takes the torque in, there's a chain right here, and it splits it off to the front drive. So if we're in two-wheel drive, which this one is, we just send torque straight through, goes to the rear only. If we put it in two-wheel drive high, that will engage a clutch pack, and the clutch pack will send torque down to here. And look what's right in line with this. Boom, front drive shaft. So two-wheel drive straight through, four-wheel drive engages the chain, and you can hear that. When you put it in four-wheel drive, you hear a lot more rotating parts when you drive this, because the chain is turning, you're hearing this actual front drive turn. Goes to the front drive shaft, and the front drive shaft goes to the front differential. The front differential goes to the CV axles. So you ever want to know if it's two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive? If it's a truck, of course, you just get your head a little bit low and look if you see that CV boot right there. See all these really cool looking trucks, they look all four-wheel drive. Sometimes they even have four-wheel drive stickers. If you don't see this, it ain't a four-wheel drive, no matter what the stickers say. So a little bit more in detail about that though. This CV axle is splined to the hub, and then it goes into this front differential, and this front differential is an ADD type. Doesn't mean it can't pay attention, it means it's automatic disconnecting differential. So basically, if we were to engage four-wheel drive high, this transfer case would engage, and it would begin to spin this front drive shaft. If you put it in four-wheel drive high and this front drive shaft doesn't spin, you got a problem in here. Or you know, this one's very basic. This one's a literal shifter, so it'd be pretty easy to diagnose. If it's a push button shifter, we're getting there, okay? If it's a push button shifter, then you may have to troubleshoot. There's going to be a motor or an actuator that shifts this transfer case. If you put it in four-wheel drive high and this doesn't turn the drive shaft, you know, you kind of know you got to troubleshoot the transfer case, shift actuator, motor, etc. It'd be something here. Now, in a different situation, let's say you put it in four-wheel drive. This engages the front drive shaft spins. Well, look, I'm spinning the front drive shaft. I don't have any wheels turning. That's because this ADD has to actually move over and actuate, and then it will lock the actual axle to the ring gear, to the carrier inside. So currently, this is not in two-wheel drive. So on these part-time four-wheel drives, part-time meaning if you can drive it in two-wheel drive rear only, or you can shift it, whether by shifter or push button, then it will become four-wheel drive, but only part-time. That, you know, would require a little troubleshooting. Is it the transfer case that's not engaging, or is it the ADD in the front that's not engaging? We'll go into more detail, but this is the part-time four-wheel drive design. The next gets a little tricky. This here GX460 is a full-time four-wheel drive. It's a sweet machine. It's brand new. Somebody messed it up, so we got it. So similar, this one happens to have a V8. This thing is sweet, really. Honestly, I'll admit. So up here you can see it's a transverse. It's a longitudinally mounted engine. We're looking at the belts up there. Pretty tough to see. There's your crankshaft. Transmission comes back. It's pretty well skid plated up, but there's your transmission to a transfer case, to the rear drive shaft, to the rear differential, transfer case over to the front drive shaft, to the front differential. So, does it seem like this is the same as the other one? Initially, yes, but this is full-time four-wheel drive. So let me explain the difference. You hop in this piece of crap, this fine unit right here, it's two-wheel drive until you pull the shifter into four. And you can do four high, or you could put it in neutral and shift the transfer case, put the transmission in neutral, shift the transfer case into four low, and you will get an additional reduction. So it'll be like an additional 3 point something to 1. We'll call it 3 to 1 reduction. So then you're going to have 3 times the torque at 1/3 the speed. Four-wheel drive low has a sequence. You can't just yank it in four-wheel drive low. You could shift this to four-wheel drive high on the fly. That's because it has a clutch pack to engage. Four-wheel drive low does not. You have to actually engage the planetary gear set, which means you have to completely stop. And because they're worried about torque transfer, you actually have to place the transmission in neutral and then go to four-wheel drive high or four-wheel drive low. So that one's got a little sequence. They all do. If that was a push button, you literally press the four-wheel drive low and it will just flash at you, basically telling you no, until you go to four-wheel drive high, then you shift into neutral, then you shift into four-wheel drive low, and you'll feel a big, and then all of a sudden it'll have a ton of torque, but the RPMs will go up really fast. This one, you hop in this sucker and you just drive. It's in four-wheel drive right now, all the time. Well, this is the problem, and we got to go back and forth a lot. If this one is in four-wheel drive, this transfer case has no differential front to rear. So because this one's four-wheel drive, you have to have the exact circumference within 3% tires front to rear, or you will severely overheat this transfer case while you're in four-wheel drive. Understand that. If you were to put a brand new tire on the back and all these other three were bald, and you were to really only drive it in two-wheel drive, that wouldn't overheat your transfer case. That might make your rear differential work hard because you'd have a bigger tire and a smaller tire, but you know, these are a little more forgiving. The transfer case is not forgiving at all. It's a literal one-to-one lockup. Even further, if you were to take this vehicle and drop it down and try to drive it, which you're going to do, by the way, on dry pavement, if you were to try to do this turn right here, this thing would be doing gear windup. It'd be chirping and squirking and it wouldn't even want to move. The reason why, if you picture this turn, there's an arc, right? By the time your front wheels are kind of turning out here and your back wheels are making the turn a little tighter, the front wheels would have to turn faster than the rear wheels. And again, no differential here means it can't do that, which means if you make this turn, the rear wheels are going to actually try to slip. They're going to be doing a small burnout to turn the same speed as the back ones, and the whole thing is going to feel horrific. So real quick, if you just wanted to check four-wheel drive, pop it in four-wheel drive and try to do a tight turn like that, and if it binds up, four-wheel drive's working. If it does this turn smoothly, four-wheel drive's not working. So how can this be in four-wheel drive on dry pavement? Well, that's why we're here. We've got a differential here, side to side. That's going to allow for turns. We've got a differential here, front differential under the skid plate, side to side, going to allow for turns. There it is. You just barely see it in there. I follow the CV axle. So this transfer case has what's known as a center diff. So a center differential means if you are just in regular four-wheel drive, which is how you get in the vehicle without pressing any buttons, there's a differential to allow for a different rear drive shaft to front drive shaft speed. See how this one's already locked? It's because they're already locked in the transfer case and it's in park. Whereas that one's free floating on the FJ Cruiser because it's in two-wheel drive. So this one, well, the internal differential will allow you to navigate that turn with speed difference. It's not going to chirp and bump and buck and you know, it's not going to do any of that. The differential is going to make up for that. So here's the thing. If you were in four-wheel drive on this and you were to get this tire in the snow, ice, mud, or whatever, all the torque could actually be sent to here, right? Because the differential is going to send the torque to the least resistance, and this differential within the transfer case is going to send the torque to the least resistance. So all the torque might go here to there, and that one spins. If you're stuck in one of these, which is the same as a Land Cruiser, what you'd need to do is you'd actually need to push a button, diff lock, center diff lock. Center diff lock is going to move this actuator. This actuator is actually going to lock the rear drive to the front drive, and now you're locked one-to-one, and it's going to force this drive shaft to turn and this one to turn at the same speed, which is sweet. That's what we need. So if that one was in the ice and this one was in the dry, this one would crawl us out. Or if both of them were in the dry, it would crawl us out. But let's say in a different situation, if this one was in the ice and you locked the center diff, now it crawls that one, but that one's in the ice. Torque is going to go 50% here, 50% here, and you're still stuck. So the next step would be, if equipped, to lock the rear differential. And I'm looking at this one, and I don't think this one's got a rear diff lock. So we could do one of two things. We could actually pulse the ABS, and we could lock this wheel up with the caliper, and then send the torque to this wheel and crawl us out. That's called the A-track system. That's using ABS to act as a limited slip differential. It could also have a limited slip differential by clutch packs, but the better setup, in a way, is actually in this FJ Cruiser. If you were stuck in that situation, right, you'd put this in 4 high, and this tire was turning and that tire was turning. How could we make that tire turn? Well, I'll tell you. This one actually has an E-locker, so this is the rear diff lock function. So you could actually push rear diff lock button, and this would boom lock this to this 1-to-1, and our torque would be split. So if you think about that, in a way, this FJ Cruiser is really well equipped if you get stuck with an axle differential traction problem. If you lose traction left to right, this has a diff lock, which is superior to that rear axle. However, this one being full-time four-wheel drive, you mostly be able to maintain your momentum and probably not get stuck. Now, this one also can go into four-wheel drive low. So you have to first center diff lock this, and then you can go, which is equivalent of like, basically it's going to be similar to this one, like four-wheel drive with no diff lock. So center diff lock this first, and then you can shift into four-wheel drive low, and that'll give you a 3-to-1-ish reduction here. On a real off-road package like vehicle, sometimes they're 4-to-1. You get a lot of torque. So the Land Cruiser is slightly different, and the Land Cruiser often has a rear diff lock and full-time four-wheel drive, but this one's still really well equipped. So that kind of runs through the rear-wheel drive lines. Now, if you had the Alpha off-road vehicles, Jeep Wrangler Rubicon would have actually part-time four-wheel drive like this, but a rear diff lock and a front diff lock. Same with the Colorado and Silverado ZR2, rear diff lock, front diff lock. Same with the older generation Raptor, rear diff lock, front diff lock. And my favorite vehicle of all time, my Hummer H3T, has rear diff lock, front diff lock. But when you have both diffs locked up, they are squirrely. Like, steering is very hard to get to come off center. So if you're trying to navigate a turn with the diffs locked, it's fighting you. So next step that gets taken care of our truck, SUV, rear wheel drive stuff is just a basic front wheel drive vehicle. This happens to be a Corolla. This happens to be a rare Corolla manual model. So in primarily front wheel drive vehicles, we've got a transversely mounted engine. So you'll notice that's the wheel and that's the crankshaft. This engine's in sideways, which means the transmission is in sideways as well. This transmission has a differential built into it, so it's not really a transmission, it's a transaxle. So we got a manual 6-speed transaxle here. Torque comes in through the crankshaft. The transaxle is going to do what it needs to do with gear ratios, and then eventually spit it out the side and go to our differential. This differential, I believe, is an open differential, which would mean if this tire is stuck in the snow, ice, mud, etc., all the torque is going to go here, and this one's just going to spin. This one's just going to hang out. Again, we could manipulate the ABS to possibly get this one to hook up a little for us and get us some traction. If it had an LSD, limited slip differential, there would be most likely clutches in here. The faster that wheel turns, the faster the differential gears spin, and as they spin faster, they put a thrust force on the clutches and tend to lock the clutches and engage this one. But I believe it's an open differential. So note, no drive shaft. You could put big tires and small tires. We just really want the tires to be the same left to right, because otherwise we're going to overwork that differential, which is part of the transaxle. And there you go, 1 CV and 1 CV, and the quick check, no CV, no axles in there. Now let's compare that to, right, so that's front wheel drive. Let's compare that to an all-wheel drive. When I say all-wheel drive, I mean something that's primarily front wheel drive with the rear added. Oh, I got it lowered down, I gotta relift it. Okay, so here we are with a primarily front wheel drive. Check it out. transversely mounted. That's where the crankshaft is. Into a transaxle. Get the lighting a little better here. And literally, this is a Highlander. They make Highlanders front-wheel drive. This is exactly what you'd see. Just like this. However, what they've done is they've gone onto the differential where the front axles are, and they've added what we call a lot of times a power takeoff transfer case. They may call it PTO transfer case. So rather than that being a CV axle right there, we've got this additional small unit. You can see, I'm just going to do the perimeter of it. This is a pretty small, basic transfer case. And then out the other side of the transfer case, we still get the CV axle. But what's changed, and you can see some fins for cooling, so I'm gonna say, good chance this is gonna be a viscous coupling style. We've got the drive shaft added on. Kind of, not really as an afterthought, but clearly this is designed to be a front wheel drive primarily. And then we'll add that PTO transfer case and pull a drive shaft off the back. This one has actually got a center support bearing and a second center support bearing in a different type of joint, and U-joints to companion flange on. Okay, they're actually doing most of the work back here. This is the first one. This is the first time I've actually lifted this car. So we've got a rear differential going to the two axles. Okay, and this differential has a lot of stuff going to it, so I'm gonna be willing to bet, without looking it up, I'm gonna say that we're likely having some clutch packs in that housing right there. See if I can get the light a little better. So we probably have the drive shaft turn. In fact, let me test that. They got the parking brake on. So this drive shaft's most likely going to turn, and then if these clutches are applied, it will transfer it from the pinion back to the ring gear. But if these clutches are released, it probably won't. So this may more be like an all-wheel drive on demand. The reason this is all-wheel drive is mostly for marketing. The fact that it's a small type of an SUV, they want to call it an all-wheel drive. But what I say almost all the time is true. If it's primarily front-wheel drive with the PTO transfer case added, they will almost always consider that an all-wheel drive. The other factor is you don't have any buttons in there. You can't shift it from front-wheel drive to all-wheel drive. It just does all-wheel drive all the time, or all-wheel drive on demand, so as needed. So if it sees with the wheel speed sensors the front wheels start to slip, it can activate these clutches. Right, if we see 20 miles an hour on the front wheels and 10 on the rear, we know we're starting to spin the front. Activate the clutches, engage the rear drive. We even have a hybrid RAV4 that has no rear drive shaft, and it has only an electric motor in the back called MGR, and that would also pulse the rear wheels as needed to maintain traction. So again, primarily front wheel drive, no buttons to press, and in this style vehicle, they're probably going to consider it an all-wheel drive. It's a little different than a four-wheel drive. So we got one more vehicle now. One more. It's not a Toyota. So that gets through really the main Toyota drive lines. But now we got a Subaru. The reason I want to include a Subaru is the Subaru is different right from the get-go. So this is going to be, you'll know exactly what I mean. So this Subaru is actually a longitudinally mounted engine. You can't see that the belts are actually in the front. This thing's pretty well skid plated up. The belts are right there. The engine is small and flat because it's a pancake, you could call it, an opposed 4-cylinder. That's a cylinder head on the side. That's a cylinder head on the side. It keeps the center of gravity really low, but you can see this right here really resembles a transmission. However, that's different. So let's just say it was like a transmission. You can see it's going to a rear drive shaft right in line. So in that sense, it's very similar to a rear wheel drive. And here's the differential, and they tend to be a little smaller, and it's got the two CV axles out to the wheels. However, what's very different about a Subaru is they actually have the two front axles come out of this same unit. So Subaru calls this a transaxle, but it's a unique transaxle. It's longitudinally mounted, and right from the get-go, this was designed to have front axles and a front differential and a rear drive shaft and a differential. So what's unique about the Subaru is that they're really designed to be all-wheel drive right from the factory. You can't get this model in a front-wheel drive. They don't make them optional where it's like it's mostly a front-wheel drive, but they tack on rear-wheel drive to make it an all-wheel drive. Like, this is an all-wheel drive vehicle right from the get-go. Not really saying it's better or worse, just saying it's very clear that Subaru is doing all-wheel drive, whereas most other manufacturers are kind of like, well, we'll make the front-wheel drive, but for the diehards, we'll give them all-wheel drive if they want to pay the extra fee. It's all included. So this one's especially unique because, again, no buttons to be pressed. It's driving the front and the rear all the time, and that's why I would consider it all-wheel drive. They can also pulse the ABS on this to act like a differential lock. But what's really cool about some of these, not this particular model, this is a Crosstrek, but we do have an STI or two around here. The STI actually has an all-wheel drive biasing function where they will manipulate the clutches in here, and they'll let you send a little extra torque to the rear to help you get the rear loose and get you drifting a little bit in your rally racing. And by sending more torque to the rear, we're sending less to the front. So they can do like a front rear all-wheel drive bias function. And that's on the center console. If you're sitting in it, it'd be right here, and you could do center diff plus or center diff minus and feel a little bit of the difference. So, you know, Subaru's all-wheel drive is very unique, and I'd say it's overall pretty good. So I'm gonna say that's about everything. About everything that we got. You know, just maybe outer CV joint, inner CV joint. The main purpose of the outer and the inner. The outer is for turning as you steer the wheels. The inner actually plunges. So if the suspension travels, the inner gets longer and shorter. You know, we'll go in more detail on a lot of this stuff, but I can see the basic layouts now, all in under 30 minutes.